What is up, my friends? Welcome back to another video. Today we are taking a look at the flute and piccolo section of the orchestra. Now, these are the woodwinds, right? So now we're diving into the next section. We already covered the strings. Now we're diving into the next section. For me, it's the woodwinds. And as a former flute and piccolo player, I really appreciate how much air and how much dedication it actually takes to play these instruments. And yeah, they have a special place in my heart for sure. So before we really dive into them, I want to give you my 10 steps to a clear orchestral sound guide. It's kind of a guide that goes over 10 really important things you need to know to take your mockups from good to great, in my opinion. Talks about things like balance, orchestration, knowing how to actually understand the timbres of the instruments properly, so on and so forth. So I promise you, if you internalize these things and really practice them, then your mockups will just sound so much better right away. So it's a free guide. If you want to download it, in the box below, it'll take you straight there and you can download it for free as my gift to you. Let's talk about the flute and the piccolo. First of all, the flute kind of started in pairs in the Baroque and classical periods, and then there was three, right, with the piccolo added, and then even 4 or 5 in the 20th century. So over time, more flutes were added, but the piccolo is only one instrument there. We only really need one because of its sound and its signature. The flute uses the most air out of all the woodwinds, and I can attest to that. It definitely does. But overall, it's very agile and very light, which I really like. It's also quite impressive in its higher registers. So its pure, bright, and shrill sound, especially when you approach the high notes by step, you can really hear how the sound signature gets more and more harsh and more shrill, especially in the piccolo. The flute itself, it's a more creamy sound, I would say, compared to the piccolo, but the piccolo really is the highest instrument we have in the orchestra. It's very useful for solos, counterpoint, doubling, runs, and chordal textures. I've used them for all these different purposes, but these are just very common ones as well. And in terms of the piccolo, again, it's the highest instrument in the orchestra. It's very agile and shrill in the upper registers, and only one is typically needed in an ensemble setting. It also shares similar abilities to the flute, so very agile, can double very well, do chords and stuff maybe in its lower registers, but generally, because it's so shrill, you only need one in the context of a fuller orchestra. Now, let's talk about some pros and cons to using these instruments. So the flute can add a very expressive and airy quality to any existing arrangement. And I've said before in the violins video that I like to use the flute to kind of double the violins, right? To add a creamier quality to an existing arrangement. Generally, the flute has a very gentle and warm sound, and it can be really magical when played in the higher registers. It feels like we're being lifted, like the energy is lifting up another level. I really enjoy that. And the piccolo really cuts through the orchestra very well, and again, only one is typically needed. Both instruments are also very nimble and agile, which makes them perfect for runs and fluttering textures. Now, I have to mention that the piccolo is pretty shrill, so having it play at a louder dynamic all the time can be fatiguing for them and our ears as well. So you want to be careful there. Don't let the piccolo player go too high, use too much air, and then they'll just blow everyone's ears out. So just be careful with that. Naturally, they use a lot of air, so they have to take regular breaths. So you can't write lines that go for minutes on end without any breaks. You need to give them a breath every few bars. It's very important, especially for, just in general playing, or I guess increasing endurance as well, right? It's good practice. And also the flute is relatively quiet, so it can't really cut through a mix very well. So you would just want to make sure when you're orchestrating that the rest of the instruments are pulling back, there's less going on there, so the flute has more room to present itself up front. So what are my favorite ways to use these instruments? Number one, I like to layer the flute with violins to add texture and air. I also like to use the piccolo to perform like high tremolos and textures beautifully in the background. It can kind of represent birds in the sky, right? You've kind of heard this before. In terms of runs and transitions, I really like to use them as well to go into larger sections. Again, we talked about how agile they are, and how easy it is to perform these kind of runs and textures. So I would just use them commonly for, let's say, an adventure score or more of a fantasy thing. If I want to accentuate the downbeat of the next section, then that's what I would do. And finally, I like to use the alto flute as well, because it's a popular alternative to the regular flute, which extends the lower range and makes it even more mellow. Now keep in mind, as it goes lower, it's not as easily heard. So again, you want to make sure the rest of your arrangement behind it doesn't overpower the alto flute. The alto flute is probably the quietest instrument that I know of in the orchestra, to be honest. So you want to take caution when writing for that. But yeah, that's kind of generally my purposes for these two instruments, the flute and piccolo. And let me know if you use them in your contexts, in your orchestral productions. I'd love to know. And before you go, again, I want to give you my 10 steps to a clear orchestral sound guide. And again, it goes through some very common things we should know and practice in order to make our mock-up sound really decent, very good as well. Hopefully that helps, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.